Hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Dani, and today Great.com talks with Sarah Barber, Executive Director at South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, or SCCADVASA. If you haven't heard of it yet, its mission is to serve as a collective voice promoting the prevention of domestic violence and sexual assault in South Carolina. Before we begin, remember, if you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. Hi, Sarah, and welcome to our podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me and for talking to us about this important issue in South Carolina and across the world.
Wow, absolutely. Actually, thank you for accepting our invitation. I think this is, especially, I would say, after the pandemic, is an issue that has its numbers skyrocketing, I'd say, which is a shame. It's something that I don't think we talk about enough times and in enough ways that we can stop it happening. So I hope that in this conversation we can bring more people around this topic, and maybe, if not people that can help, maybe people that need help might reach out to you guys. But let's begin from some point else, because last year you celebrated 40 years of existence of serving the community. And I'm very interested in knowing how it all began, how it all happened.
So the existence of SCCADVASA really mirrors the focus of attention, the public attention on domestic and sexual violence in the United States. Is when these crimes started to be criminalized and paid attention to by the criminal legal system, whereas before they had been seen as things that happened behind closed doors and things that you didn't really talk about outside the home. So it kind of mirrors that arc in the United States. SCCADVASA was formed by a few women who were working in the early rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs in South Carolina, some of whom are still doing that work 40 years later. And they formed together because they thought as a collective they would have a stronger voice in trying to influence public policy, to advocate for funding, to support services. So they came together. We have now grown to be 22 member organizations across our state who provide direct services to survivors and victims of domestic and sexual violence. Also a little bit of trafficking, where there's that intersection. And then, we here at SCCADVASA, apart from our legal program, we do not actually provide direct services. We do the public policy. We are the public policy arm, speaking for the needs of survivors and our member organizations up at the State House and in Congress. We do a lot of things like this, a lot of media work. We run social media campaigns. We do a lot of training. Like last week, we did a training with someone who works with an offender program who was talking about the importance of a holistic approach to domestic violence, which, 200 people were on that webinar. It's also recorded so people can access it later. We do a lot of prevention work and also a lot of technical assistance work. The legal program I talked about, which started with a grant from the South Carolina Bar Foundation and is now expanded with a grant from the Office of Violence Against Women, served over 200 survivors last year, linking them with free to them attorneys who can assist them in civil legal matters.
Wow, this is just amazing. And I gotta say that I don't want to use the word blame, but it's the one that comes to mind. But I can only relate this extent of work that you can do to this collaborative view, right, that you just mentioned. And let's talk about it for a second. I have other questions, but since you brought it up, I think this is vital. But how exactly does it work? How it happens? You said it somewhat. SCCADVASA helps to manage all of this and get people in touch and create this net. But could you explain it a little further so we can understand it better?
Yeah, so our daily work is a very sort of macro approach to domestic and sexual violence, while our member programs are providing services to people who reach out to them. So like last year, our member programs served, over 20,000 survivors of domestic violence, 5,000 survivors of sexual assault. And the help they provide ranges from emergency shelter to counseling to some legal advocacy to economic advocacy to working with systems to try and help those survivors navigate the multiple systems that they have to deal with as they try and seek a path to safety for them and their children. What we do sort of on a daily basis is a little bit removed from that, but also an essential component. It's focused more on the community, society, and making change. So like in any one week, like I said, we could have one or more webinars. We could be meeting with a SART team, which is a sexual assault response team, trying to bring together systems and advocates, anyone who works with sexual assault, to try and think of more creative and better ways to improve outcomes for survivors. I might be at the State House either giving testimony on a bill that we're supporting, or just as importantly on a bill we're trying to stop that may have negative. So really trying to educate the community and build awareness of the things that might help, the things that absolutely will not help, to break down traditional ideas or incorrect information about these issues, which are so prevalent in our state and throughout the world.
Since you mentioned your state, I think it would be nice to have some context on this, because I'm personally not really familiar to the history and the political context, the political background and social background of South Carolina. So could you provide us some overview of this prevalence of domestic violence in your state, maybe even how it compares to other states in the country?
Sure. Well, South Carolina has a really terrible and sexual assault too. So statistics vary. Like every set of statistics is a different lens through which to look at an issue. So the CDC, which is our National Healthcare Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, releases the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is a telephone survey that's surveyed thousands of people at this point. And by that, they estimate the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence and different behaviors. So in South Carolina, they estimate that over 42% of women have at least one lifetime experience of contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking. That's a huge number of people. I mean, that's almost half the women. Numbers for men are lower, but not as low as you would think. They're still in like the 30%. So that's one way of looking at it. If you look at law enforcement statistics, there were 57 domestic violence homicides in 2021 in South Carolina. There were 25,000 what are classified as simple assaults, lower level violence that were reported to the police. There were almost 5,000 more serious assaults reported to the police. So we know that reporting to the police is an undercount of violence, but still huge numbers, multiple thousands of people every year, and then 57 deaths. The US has the horrible distinction of being one of the countries with the highest levels of femicide, 11 times higher than comparable countries, and that is just point blank because of the awareness of the availability of firearms in this country. And if there is a household in which domestic violence is present and there is also a firearm in that house, it increases the probability that the woman will be killed by 500%, 5 times more likely to die if there's a firearm in the house. So We also last year, the university and the Jamie Kimball Foundation, which was founded by the parents of a woman who was murdered, an intimate partner homicide, estimates that every year there's around 80,000 incidents of domestic violence. So around almost 2.5, 3 times what's reported to law enforcement. And that it costs, domestic violence just alone costs South Carolina around $358 million a year in lost productivity, in criminal justice costs, in medical costs, in all the different ways. And they used advanced economic modeling, which of course I have no understanding of, to come up with that figure. Sexual assault, if the average cost, the average financial cost, and sometimes we talk in financial costs because it seems like people understand that more. The average financial cost to a victim of sexual violence, when you think about hospital therapy, law enforcement response, if there is one, is around $110,000, $120,000. So huge financial costs, but also, those are numbers, right? The statistics are numbers, but behind every one of those numbers is someone's story of pain, of trauma, and of trying to put a life together after something absolutely devastating has been done to them.
I'm just shocked by the numbers. I've got to tell you, it's insane. And I think I live and as heavy as reality here in Brazil, our numbers are pretty shocking as well. And it's just devastating to know, and especially this point when you mentioned there are lives behind each one of these numbers, and not just a woman's lives, but a family life. Their parents, maybe their children, their friends, everybody around suffers as well.
Yeah, and the ripple effects are huge.
Absolutely. And that's what makes me think about, and I gotta say this, I love the way you answered this question because you brought to light so many aspects of it that just highlights the importance of fighting against it and speaking up to help change laws, change society points, the way that we address it. Because you mentioned financial costs for the state, financial personal costs. There is a social issue with the gun use. So there are so many things behind it. So it's like, for me, from my perspective, you have a number here, and then you have the ripple effect that affects everybody else. That's also like this internal ripple effect that keeps it happening, keeps it triggering all the time. And with that, I need to ask you about this advocacy work that you do. How do you actually tackle that? You mentioned a few things, of course, but I'm more interested here on the differences that you might find with your audiences. Because one thing is going to talk about it with politicians, but another one is talk about it with a marginalized community, with a wealthy community. How do you manage all of this, and what is your approach?
It's very challenging to try and find messages that resonate with different communities and build from that a sustained and unified approach to the issue. I live in a fairly conservative state, so the way I have to talk about and find common language with politicians can be challenging. Right, it can be very challenging. Finding common language with faith communities can potentially be challenging. I think to prevent sexual violence, we have to talk about sex. They may not want to talk about sex at all. And so where do we find our common value? Which our common value is nobody wants this to happen. But how do we find messaging that resonates and that people will accept and move forward? Because we do know, so in the context of sexual violence, that if we have comprehensive health education where we speak honestly about sex and relationships with young people, then we are giving them the skills necessary for them to have healthy relationships. And if we couple that with talking about refusal skills, learning how to say no to someone and having those boundaries, we can reduce sexual violence on college campuses by around 50%. So how do we bridge those gaps, right? I mean, I think that's the challenge, and we don't have the answer, right? We're still working on trying to find those answers. Um, but I think it's there, and I think um, a we have a mandate in our work, but it's also an essential thing as a society. And I think in some ways it's becoming even more challenging. I think there's levels of misogyny are rising. We see, influencers on TikTok or wherever on any kind of social media who are really having negative impacts on views on women that's spreading to teens. And I think that's not going to help us as we try and prevent these issues. For us also trying to reach young people, I'm 55. The chances that I'm going to come up with a message that is resonant with young people are low. So it's essential that we have those voices in here. I mean, I might see something good, I'll show it to my 18-year-old and she'll look at me like, what are you doing? And I see it as both a challenge of our work to try and find that pathway to bring everybody together. But I also see, I mean, it's exciting, but it's extremely challenging too. So I hope we can keep building those efforts, learning from what we've done, what's worked, what hasn't worked, encouraging people to look at the data and focus on that sort of the outcome we all want, which is reduced harm. And how do we get there? How do we make messages? How do we adapt messages so that we're reaching everybody?
Absolutely. And I keep thinking about these challenges, and it must be really, really interesting to have this age difference and trying to get in touch with people and get a message through. It must be something else really to experience. That kind of leads me to something that oh, I gotta ask, what is your vision for the future? Like maybe in the next 5 years, what are the next steps that SCCADVASA would like to take to keep changing the reality?
So my vision, of course, is a South Carolina free from domestic violence and sexual assault. That's my long-term vision. And doing this kind of work at the sort of more macro level can be very challenging to sustain, because when you are working with people one-on-one, when you're working with victims and survivors, you are no doubt impacted by secondary trauma in what you're seeing, but you also get to see people make their changes and move towards healthier lives. At this level, when you're dealing with policy and larger societal audiences, you really don't get to see that. So you take sort of your small steps and you recognize your small successes, even if it's not everything that you wanted. When I first started in this work, my first congressional meeting was with one of our senator staff, and I was talking to them about the need to close the boyfriend loophole around firearms possession in federal law. And they weren't interested. I'll put that politely. They weren't interested in talking to me about that. Last year, President Biden signed the first firearm safety legislation in the United States in many years that at least partially closed that loophole, was one of its provisions, and that senator voted for it. So that's 8 years. It's a tiny step forward, but I can still know that where we started, we did see movement. For South Carolina, for my job for the next 5 years, the things I'm going to focus on are expanding our prevention work. We recently hired a director of prevention. Before that was sort of a coordinator job. So we've hired someone with a lot more experience, a lot of ideas. We're going to be hiring another staff member to help her. So it's only 2 staff members, but that's still a move forward in the work that we can do. We've also been fortunate enough to have funding to fund greater social media campaigns around prevention recently. So we know that we have to build prevention so that we reduce the need for intervention. And that is something that I'd like to, when I leave this work, is to know that I've done that. Another thing that I think is critical for the next 5 years is continuing our focus on how this issue intersects in different communities and what different responses look like for those communities, and to expand the options for people. I talked about how the history of SCCADVASA sort of mirrored how policy changes happened in the United States. But we also know that the criminalization and criminal justice responses do not work for everyone. They don't work for a lot of people in marginalized communities. Not everybody wants a criminal justice response. So what other options are there? I'm currently doing work with the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative and looking about what maybe restorative practices can we have that both hold people but also may lead to healing. I want to continue to focus on building the capacity of our legal program to provide services to people who can't afford an attorney, but who desperately need one in civil legal remedies. And then to keep fighting. Sometimes I don't like using the language of violence to talk about our work, but sometimes it seems to be the only thing that's appropriate. So to keep fighting for proactive legislation that will actually help, that is informed by the needs of survivors and of the people who do this work, and not by politicians who have some grand idea of what they think may be helpful that ultimately may not be and may have many unintended consequences, and to keep fighting against policies that are going to negatively impact survivors. So really just sort of keeping on, but hoping to find new creative avenues to advance the work too.
I do hope you get there and you keep finding these new avenues and new ways to approach people and change things. And with that, I think this is the most important question I can ask now. That is, how can people support the work that the coalition is doing and help end violence and sexual assault in South Carolina? What are the best ways?
Okay, so I'm going to start for on the ground. If people want to directly help survivors, we have 22 member organizations, and so I would encourage people to reach out to them, and they can be found on our website. There's a map of South Carolina. Reach out to them for volunteer opportunities, whether that's answering a hotline, painting a shelter, providing Christmas gifts for the kids who are there, providing care kits for sexual assault victims who go to the hospital, or donating to them. For us, it could be signing up from our website for our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter, and we also, during the South Carolina legislative session, we send out a weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, but mostly weekly update on what's going on at the State House. Legislators are very responsive to calls, right? Their views can be swayed by how many calls they get supporting something. So when we send out a call to action, we urge people to call or email their representatives to let them know that there's community support for what we're trying to do. And of course, like any nonprofit, donations are critical to our work. We have a lot of government funding, but there's things we can't do with that. And so the freedom of having community support or corporate support for our work is critical, especially when we're talking about our messaging campaigns, our advocacy work at State House and in Congress, and for our legal program.
Perfect. And everybody, you can find the link to their website in the description of this episode. But I'm gonna tell you, it's SCCADVASA with double C, SCCADVASA.org. And there you can get more information, you can get in touch, and you can help. Above all things, you can help. Sarah, thank you so much for this interview. I loved talking to you today. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
And for everybody listening, also thank you for staying here with us for one more episode. And remember, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that shows the algorithms that this is an important conversation. And then we can spread the word about the importance of the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Bye, and I see you at the next episode.